Hello, this is the Demographics Decoded podcast with me, demographer Simon Kuestenmacher.
And me, Michael Yardney, property and wealth creation expert, and this is the podcast where we unveil the trends shaping our future. Today we're tackling a topic that will have a profound impact on the Australian housing market. I'd like to speak with Simon about the three peaks in life that are going to determine our housing future. These demographic peaks, well, they're shifting in ways that I believe are going to reshape where and how we live. So I'm going to ask Simon about these peaks, what they are, what they mean for you, whether you're an investor, a homeowner, or simply just curious about the forces driving our property markets. I think this is going to be a show for you. So whether you're tuning in from your commute, your home office, or wherever, let's get on with the chat. Hi, Simon.
Hi. So let's discuss the three peaks. And so we could roughly label them as family formation, when we first start making babies and then have different desires in our homes. Midlife career shifts. This is when we traditionally call it midlife crisis, or we might rethink the way we acted. And of course, the big, beautiful one, retirement, when we leave the world of work behind and when we have yet an opportunity to completely reinvent ourselves.
Well, we've spoken about the different demographic trends over the last couple of episodes. We've spoken about the different stages in life. But how have the peaks varied across different generations, Simon? And what implications is these going to have?
Yeah, so if you look at family formation, simply put, with every generation we started making our babies later in life. So we pushed family formation more and more from, back in the olden days you had babies when you were able to do so. So in your teenage years, this we left completely behind. Baby boomers made babies in the early 20s, mid 20s, and nowadays the young folks make their babies in their early to mid 30s. So that of course is then there's a big shift when you make babies, because all of a sudden the small apartment that you occupy with your partner most likely becomes too small and you shift. And the bigger a generation, the more impactful this career shift or this life stage shift is. So we now see right now the biggest generation of them all, the millennials, making that family formation shift. That family formation shift means all those millennials leave the inner city hipster apartments and move to 3 and 4 bedroom homes. Then we quickly skip to the retirement phase. This is, of course, means why the hell would you need to live in the old house because you stopped working? Might as well, there's no need to live near the office tower anymore. So you might as well go to a lifestyle destination. And quite often we do this. We then move to Noosa. We move to the Sunshine Coast to make this wonderful retirement shift. That again, right now, the richest and big generation of baby boomers is doing this. So there's a lot of peak-related property change in the market right now. We haven't even talked about the midlife career shifters, those people that are reinventing themselves. And that's probably a bit smaller this time around because it is held by the Gen Xers. It's the smaller generation. So it's still an impactful driver, the upsizers. Sometimes you try to just resettle again midlife, so to speak, and move to a new city, move to a new career. But this will be smaller in this decade because it's a smaller cohort that is dominating the market.
Maybe we should talk about another shift that affects our economy, our housing markets, and that's the median income peak. When do people actually peak their income, Simon, and how does that affect their lives?
Yeah, so we tend to earn the most money, statistically speaking, in our mid-40s. So 43 tends to be the year that is most often quoted as the highest income earning year. And it makes sense because at 43 you had quite a bit of time to become better at your job. So you have a nice and high income. You had a couple of promotions. If you work for yourself, you have skills, you have a client base, you can charge higher fees. So you have a lot of money in your 40s. That's a nice peak to reach. And what we're seeing now is we have this big millennial generation currently in this peak. They are millennials are early 40s to late 20s at the moment. And so part of this cohort is already in the highest spending phase of the life cycle, highest earning phase as well. So the highest spending and highest earning phase are actually overlapping. So they turbocharge spending capacity and turbocharge the consumer market. So any kind of company that helps those millennials in their early 40s to fill their houses with crap, they're having a wonderful decade. So it's those Bed Bath and Beyonds, those Barbecue Galores, those Harvey Normans, and they have a killer decade ahead. It's guaranteed by the sheer demographic setup.
So there's really a mountain of millennials passing through this over the next decade or so. And I guess many of them are going to upgrade their homes. They're now maybe preparing for teenagers, that stage of their life. That peaks, I guess, in the late 40s or so. So they're going to build what used to be called McMansions. Are they going to be moving house to other areas? Is there the ability to find those that sort of accommodation in scale in the inner suburbs at the moment?
Yeah, so the fun thing with the millennial upgraders is that right now they're not in the upgrading phase just yet. They're early 40s, but they will be in a decade. And right then, when they're in the upgrading phase of the life cycle, we'll see the baby boomers die out of their family-sized homes at scale. And so all of a sudden, these millennials can then start competing for the baby boomer housing stock. So there is a natural increase of housing stock on the market, and the millennials can compete for it. Of course, not all millennials. It's these millennials that had successful careers, that have enough equity in their current home to then upgrade to an old boomer property, so to speak. But that's looming. That's just a decade out at this point in time.
So I guess what we're saying is housing preferences shift as you work through these peaks. What type of housing do you think is going to become more or less popular as a result of the demographic changes?
So what millennials want is, as a generation, they ultimately want to replicate their own wonderful childhood for their own kids, which is a challenge for millennials because millennials are the first generation in history that will earn, statistically speaking, less money than their parents. The boomers were particularly rich, particularly wealthy, and so to follow the traditional Australian model of the kids do better financially than their parents, that'll be very tough for millennials, and many of them will fail. But that, you asked about the desire. What they want is big homes. They want a home with a bit of space for their teenage kids, because they, as teenage kids, experienced the comforts of a larger home, of having a bit of breathing space, of being able to have people over, and so forth. And so this is what millennials will fight tooth and nail to achieve. They have many uphill battles to do so, but that's the goal of the generation.
Well, looking at a housing perspective, as I like to do, I think over the next decade there's going to be maybe three core themes moving ahead. A further studentification, if that's a word, of the inner city, and the support for build to rent also, as more of the younger people are going to be renting, and as we've discussed in previous shows, not buying their homes till later in life. There's also the second big change is the rise in lifestyle homes, as you just mentioned, suiting the middle-aged millennials, preparing for their teenagers. But then there's the emergence of the frail elderly boomer market, requiring even greater care and greater connection to the community.
Exactly, and that movement of boomers will be very difficult to manage because, well, I'm optimistic that they manage it because boomers so far completely transformed every stage of the life cycle they lived through. And the big risk in retirement is that you grow old in your family home, and that family home happens to be in a car-dependent suburb. It's one of the big scares that I see. If you live in a car-dependent suburb, your partner dies, your mental health goes down even more than when you live in a walkable community and your partner dies, because the impacts of social isolation just amplify so much more. So I would always urge the whole baby boomer cohort to move into what I would consider a walkable community. This does not need to be a retirement village. Can be one if you like that, but just a walkable neighborhood. And do so in your 70s, while you're both still mobile and agile, and while you're still flexible enough to establish a new social network, so to speak, to establish a new routine that can then guide you through the difficult times when your partner has died. And statistically speaking, that's of course much more important for the women than for the men, because the men tend to die before before their wives, because they're older and have shorter life experience. The men.
Well, maybe not shorter life experience, or maybe it is shorter life spans, but that's another story. Simon, I know as a partner in the demographics group, your job is to advise businesses and policy makers and governments. Oh, by the way, if you're interested in getting Simon to speak for your organisation, I'll leave a link in the show notes where you can contact the demographics group and have a chat about that. But Simon, how do you think urban planners and policymakers should respond to the changing timing and nature of these life peaks to make sure that we've got enough housing supply and I guess also infrastructure?
Yeah, so that's the good news. The good news is that these peaks are utterly and completely predictable. So in an ideal environment, those planners know about this stuff. They ideally have a realistic time frame that they know this is when we're retiring. They understand where the loneliness in old age is happening, so that they then plan, for example, bus routes accordingly. Frequent bus routes would be important to to coax people out of there. It would also be planners that know that people that want to retire locally, they're not downsizing, maybe not just because they're completely hung up to stay in the old family home, but they just want to stay in the area. And they cannot downsize because there are no two-bedroom retirement type apartments available in the area. So then the idea of pushing through medium density housing in what traditionally is a family dependent kind of suburb is actually enabling those people to stay in the suburb and to continue to have the benefits of their social network. So I want planners to have that in mind. You mentioned infrastructure. That's a whole different kettle of fish to be talking about, because infrastructure in this country, unfortunately, is not necessarily done by planners, but it's done by politicians. So there is a certain politicization of infrastructure, where one party says the tunnel is on, the other party says tunnel is off, and in the meantime we burn a bit of money. It's good for all the consultancies, but that's problematic. Ideally, we would depoliticize infrastructure spending. We would give more powers to planning bodies like Infrastructure Australia, or to local government planners, so that they put the relevant infrastructure in place. Of course, with financial constraints that are going to continue to be set by politicians, but it is plausible, at least, that we understand what's happening, because in Australia we do have outrageously great data to understand where people are now and to understand what's happening into the future. I think the Australian general public does not know how good our census is. Our census is literally one of the best, if not the best, in the world. We know what's coming. We run a census every 5 years. We ask 65 questions. The Americans run one every 10 years and ask 16 questions. We understand what the country is doing, and we can act wisely if we are only given the powers and tools to do so.
Well, based on that, we talk about infrastructure. That tends to, people think hard infrastructure, roads, rails, tunnels, but there's also the soft infrastructure, if that's the right word, of schools. We talked about millennials having children and going through various stages of their children, eventually teenagers. Are we going to have enough schools where the millennials are going to want to live, or where they're going to have to live?
Yeah, very good reminder to thank you, Michael, that infrastructure is not just rails and roads, but it is social infrastructure as well. So when we first look at the total number of schools that are needed, we go like, that's not too bad. We're only increasing the number of school age populations a little bit in the next decade or so, so we can easily manage that. But as you hinted at as well, unfortunately, millennials move to completely new destinations because they do not move to the middle suburbs from, as they leave the inner city behind. They can't move to the middle suburbs because their baby boomer parents are hogging the family-sized homes in those suburbs. And so the millennials increasingly move to the urban fringe and to regional centers. And that's where there are no schools. So we have plenty of areas where there is this massive surge of demand for new schools. And all the while, the demand for or the supply of school kids, so to speak, in the established suburbs slowly shrinks. And so we have an allocation problem of where do teachers go, where do schools go, how do we deal with this? It's not as easy as all the middle suburb schools have no students, because then we would just close the schools. That would be easy. It's just that they don't grow at the same rate. They slow down. And all the while we have growth at the other ends. So that's going to be a big issue, managing the social infrastructure, because teachers, we're running out of them. Many of the teachers that we have are 55 to 64, so they retire in about a decade. That has severe implications, and we still need to grow the teacher base. So how we manage the skills shortage in the teaching profession will be very, very difficult. And I fear that teachers increasingly will make economic decisions as well, because the rising cost of living, and they will increasingly go to private schools, maybe Catholic schools, where you get a bit more money. You're not showered in money, but you get a bit more money than if you work for a state-owned public school. And so I think that the teacher shortage in public schools will get even worse.
I've heard the theory that we should actually move the schools to the old, maybe unused office buildings in the centre of the CBD. And that didn't make much sense to me until I realised that our hub and spoke transport system would allow students to be able to get into the CBD pretty quickly and easily, and maybe their parents as well if they're going there for work. And there'd be, rather than the old traditional school with single-storey or double-storey and big playing yards, it would be multi-storey schools.
Yeah, so architecturally, no problem, easily done. And the logic behind this says, as you said, we have a star-shaped commuting pattern where we put everyone in, and it would be easier to do this. And it's, of course, an idea like this get put forward under the idea of a struggling CBD. You try to think about how can we revitalize the CBD if more and more office workers actually work from home, at least some of the time. You then want to fill those trains and trams that you pay for with people. You want to fill the office towers. You want to provide a bit of economic activities in the cafes and restaurants and whatever around. And yes, students would help that. And again, to be quite honest, what I think is these things are always worth a try. Just do a school. Not every city needs to do it. Melbourne or Sydney, one of them should do it. Just redo one office tower into a crazy big ass vertical school, and we'll figure it out. See whether it works. And I think that's what I want in times of rapid change. I want us to experiment a bit more. We talk in the startup world, we talk about, you want to fail a project as fast as possible. You want to set it up and then adjust. And you wouldn't do this, you wouldn't bet the whole mortgage on it. You just do it with one school. And there are thousands of schools. And so it's worth a gamble. I'm always liking this. I also like, for example, recently, if the New South Wales government forces their staff back to the office. I think it's a terrible idea, but I think it's great that one of our 8 states and territories does it. Because I might be wrong, and it might be an absolutely net positive for absolutely everything, and then it's cool, and then all the other ones should follow suit. So those little experiments I highly welcome, because I get data out of it, and we then understand better what needs doing.
Well, if we talk about the 3 peaks that we started the discussion with, family formation stage, lifestyle, career shifts, retirement, how does this differ in regional Australia? Will particular regions benefit from or struggle more with these demographic changes, Simon?
Yeah, so the regions definitely struggle more from the aging of the population, because they have a higher share of a regional area in the retirement stage. So that will have a bigger impact. So that means you'll have more people that potentially want to downsize, more people that potentially want to move into an aged care home, more people that sooner or later need care. And they, of course, need care based on a smaller workforce. Traditionally, the regions had a nice ace up their sleeve. They could say, yeah, we don't offer all the amenities of the big cities, but we offer you much cheaper housing. It's much more affordable to live in the regions. That worked like a charm. But now that we saw more population growth than usual in those regional areas, it just took a tiny bit more growth than usual to drive house prices up like crazy. And you have plenty of regional areas in Australia where house prices went from 350,000 people at the beginning of the pandemic to close to $600,000 today. They almost doubled. We're talking 60, 70, 80% of house price growth. And that's because it only takes so little to make this move upwards. The positive story is, of course, it will take very little additional development to drive prices downwards again. But of course, do we have the right workers to do it? Do we have the political will? Do we have the right zoning in place? Do we also build the infrastructure that needs to follow those houses? Because quite often it's the states that build infrastructure and they are not focusing on the regions because they have all the shortage everywhere. So ultimately, to answer your question in this long-winded way, the regions will be seeing all those difficulties in a much more intense version.
Okay, finally, what advice would you give to property investors who are wanting to understand these trends and invest in the right locations or the right sort of properties?
Yeah, I think that's part of the property picking game, is to roughly understand what market segments are growing and then to understand where people might want to live. So the dumb, cheap version is always to say, well, we have such a crazy shortage, whatever you build, somebody is willing to buy it and you can make a profit. But you, of course, want to pick the most lucrative properties. So you want to find out what are people willing to pay a premium for. And the retirees, they will want to either move to a wonderful lifestyle destination where they get nature, where they have access to services, where they have nice restaurants to go to, nice cafes to go to, where they have enough space so that they have friends and family visit, where they might be in relatively close distance to an airport so that they can go explore the world. That's, if you have a destination like this, you have a jackpot. If you make sure that the destination for those retirees is walkable, you know that they will be paying a premium for that as well. So there are quite a few easy ways to look at this by really honestly putting yourself into the shoes of the people that you're trying to sell. Yeah, and then understand what they want, and also trying to understand, is the market that I'm aiming for, this particular cohort, is that actually a growing cohort? And those peaks that we are discussing here, they're growing, especially the family formation stage. If you offer family-sized housing to millennials, you're set, because they need this for the next 13, 14 years. This will not dry up. It can't. It will be there. It's just a matter of, do you make the absolute optimum out of your opportunity?
Well, as a property investor, rather than selling, you're wanting others around you to buy property similar to what you own to push up the values of what the properties you own. And similarly, even more affluent people are renting at the moment. That's been shown. So not everyone who rents is poor. So I'd be looking at areas where the locals are getting higher income, higher growth income than average for the state, areas that are gentrifying and changing and improving, and areas where people want to rent maybe because it's a good school zone or good lifestyle area, and some actually choose to rent to get the lifestyle they want. And then, as we've spoken in previous shows, Rentvest, they'll live where they want to, they'll rent where they want to enjoy their life, and invest where they can afford to.
Exactly, and always, of course, this is the collective perspective. The individual perspective is also that you need to take your future into account with those decisions. And I think we'll have more millennials who are willing to rent because they go, I provide the kind of housing experience that I want for my kids, but they understand that if they have two kids, they only need a family-sized home for about 2 decades. After this, they kick the kids out and you can then downsize. And so you understand, maybe if I only need this family-sized house for 2 decades, I can rent and I can maybe then speculate on how big my inheritance might be and when I might get it. And inheritances tend to be handed out about 5-6 years before retirement, before you retire these days. And so that means, maybe I can then just, worst case scenarios, I take this inheritance and buy my retirement apartment from it. I think more and more millennials will think in these type of ways, because as we discussed in the past, they want certain kind of experiences, and that does not necessarily mean music festivals, but it means the experience of that I want my kids to have as they grow up.
Well, as we've often said, demographics is really a crystal ball. We know how many people are in Australia at various age groups. We know the age group that people are immigrating to Australia. So it's not too hard to forecast at least a decade in the future of what's happening. And so this was an interesting insight into some of the changes that are going to affect our housing markets. Simon, I look forward to catching up with you next week. But if I could just give a quick message to those who've listened to the show, if you've got some benefit from Simon's wisdom, and I do call it wisdom, it's great perspective, whether you're a business owner, an investor, an entrepreneur, please subscribe to this show and also tell somebody else about it to help build our audience, which is building fantastically anyway, but we'd love to get this message out to more people. Simon, I look forward to catching up with you again next week.
Also, I'll catch you soon.
This Demographics Decoded podcast was brought to you by Metropole Property Strategists. We provide a complete range of services to help our clients safely create intergenerational wealth through strategic property and wealth advice. If you're looking to buy an investment property or your next home, why not have a discovery chat with one of our wealth strategists? Go to metropole.com.au and explore your options. You'll find we're much more than just another buyer's agent. We provide a complete range of services, including property and wealth advisory, home buying, buyer's agency, property management, renovations, and development management services. The team will help you with frameworks that I've fine-tuned over 5 decades, and we've been helping clients with for over 25 years. We're big enough to tip the scales in your favour, but still small enough to care. You can follow me on social media, but I suggest you also follow Simon Kuestenmacher. You'll find him regularly posting on all the social media platforms. I'll include links in the show notes. And thanks for spending the last little while with Simon and me. I hope you got some benefit from the show. And if you did, and you know somebody else who'd also benefit, please tell them about the Demographics Decoded podcast. There's a share button on every podcast app. You'll be doing them a favour. I hope you will anyway, and you're definitely going to be doing us a favour, helping us in our quest to make as many people as possible aware of the demographic changes that are going to shape their future. And of course, any of the discussion we had today was not personal advice about your future, but just general information to help inform you.